I was thinking about the person who gave you that locket.
It was my mother's. She told me it was a gift from a man who promised her the world before he went out to conquer it.
Lucian Virelli, the most feared CEO on Wall Street, is seconds away from signing a $500 million merger that will cement his legacy. But as his pen touches the paper, the doors burst open. His new assistant, Lyra, isn't just there to bring him coffee. She's holding a file that proves his entire board of directors is walking him into a death trap. As the Viper looks up in fury, he notices a vintage locket around Lyra's neck, the exact same one he gave to a woman he abandoned 25 years ago. Is she here to save his empire, or is this the ultimate act of revenge from the daughter he never knew he had? You won't believe the massive power reversal that happens in Chapter 9, so make sure you watch until the very end to see if Lucian chooses his billions or his blood. If you love high-stakes stories of justice served and billionaire drama, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss a chapter of this viral saga. Lucian Virelli sat in his leather chair, the high-back silhouette making him look like a king on a glass throne overlooking the fractured skyline of the city. To the world, he was the Viper, a man who had built a multi-billion-dollar empire by shedding anyone who showed a hint of weakness or warmth. His office was a fortress of cold steel and silent tension, a place where trust went to die. He had just scrubbed his executive floor of 3 senior VPs suspected of disloyalty, leaving a vacuum of power that most would fear to fill. Yet standing before him was a young woman who seemed entirely unimpressed by the predatory stillness of the room. Lyra Ellington didn't fidget. She stood with a clipboard tucked under her arm, her wavy blonde hair catching the afternoon sun as she waited for him to speak. Lucian studied her with a clinical intensity, searching for the telltale signs of a corporate plant or a social climber. He saw none. Instead, he saw a reflection of a fire he hadn't encountered in decades. His no-trust policy was the iron rule of his life, a survival mechanism honed through years of underworld-style business warfare where one wrong move meant total liquidation. "You're overqualified, Miss Ellington," Lucian stated, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that usually sent subordinates scurrying for the door. "A master's in forensic accounting and a background in digital security. You should be running a firm, not managing my schedule." "I'm not interested in running a firm, Mr. Virelli," Lyra replied, her smile professional yet strangely knowing. "I'm interested in the truth. And in this building, the truth is currently buried under 5 layers of fraudulent shell companies." Lucian leaned forward, his salt and pepper beard catching the light as his sharp jawline tightened. He hadn't mentioned the internal audit to anyone. The fact that she had already sniffed out the rot in his foundation was either a sign of supreme brilliance or a sophisticated threat. His instinct told him to eliminate her as a risk, just as he had done with everyone else who got too close to his armor. But then she moved to hand him a file, and the light hit the vintage locket resting against her white blouse. Lucian's breath hitched in a way he hadn't felt since he was 23 years old. It was a delicate hand-engraved piece, one he had bought with his first real paycheck for a woman he had promised to never leave, only to break that promise the moment the scent of power reached his nostrils. The shadow of his past had just walked into his future. He knew logically that hiring her was a breach of every security protocol he owned. She was a wild card in a game of fixed stakes. Yet as he looked into her bright, defiant eyes, the coldness that had defined his career began to feel like a heavy, suffocating weight. "Start Monday," he snapped, leaning back and masking his turmoil with a scowl. "If you miss a single detail, you're out. I don't give second chances." "I don't need them," Lyra said softly, turning to leave. As the heavy mahogany door clicked shut, Lucian stared at the empty space she left behind. He had just invited the one thing he feared most into his inner sanctum, a connection he couldn't control. The Viper had a new shadow, and for the first time in his life he wasn't sure if he was the one doing the hunting. The silence of the executive suite usually felt like a shield, but tonight, it felt like an interrogation. Lucian sat alone, the city lights bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, predatory shadows across his desk. He shouldn't have hired her. His no-trust policy was the only reason he'd survived this long in a world of vipers. Yet he had just handed the keys to his kingdom to a girl who looked like a memory he had spent 25 years trying to bury. With a sharp, decisive click of his mouse, he bypassed the encrypted firewall of his own HR department. The digital folder for Lyra Ellington flickered onto the screen. Lucian's eyes, usually as cold as the glass surrounding him, scanned the lines of code and data with a frantic, uncharacteristic energy. He saw the accolades, the top-tier degree, the impeccable security clearances, but he kept scrolling, searching for the one thing that would prove his intuition wrong. He reached the emergency contact section and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. Mother. Elena Ellington. The name hit him like a physical blow. Elena. The woman he had left behind in a dusty coastal town when the siren song of Manhattan's billions became too loud to ignore. He remembered the way she looked in the light of that final summer, the same way Lyra looked now, full of a quiet, stubborn integrity that he had traded for a silk suit and a corner office. The timeline was a jagged blade. Lyra was 24, born exactly 9 months after he had vanished without a word. He leaned back, his breath hitching as he stared at the screen. He wasn't just a CEO anymore. He was a man standing on the edge of a massive, personal realization. Lyra hadn't just applied for a job, she had infiltrated his life. Was this a daughter seeking the father she never had, or was she the ultimate Trojan horse, sent by Elena to dismantle the man who had abandoned them both? The stakes of his current $500 million merger suddenly felt trivial compared to the emotional war now brewing within his own walls. Lucian closed the laptop, the glow of the screen lingering in his vision like a ghost. He looked at the empty chair where Lyra had stood earlier, realizing that his empire was no longer his most guarded secret. She was. He had spent his life avoiding ghosts from the past, only to hire one as his personal shadow. The Viper was no longer the only predator in the room. He was being watched by a pair of eyes that shared his own DNA. The morning air in the executive suite was thick with the scent of expensive espresso and the electric hum of high-stakes tension. Lucian watched Lyra from the corner of his eye as she moved with a quiet, methodical efficiency that mirrored his own. He was still reeling from the revelation in her HR file, his mind a battlefield between the cold CEO who trusted no one and the man who had just realized he had a daughter. He wanted to confront her, to ask about Elena, but the $500 million merger with Lucian Virelli was a freight train that wouldn't stop for personal ghosts. Lyra was hunched over the final merger contracts, her brow furrowed in a way that reminded Lucian painfully of the woman he'd left behind. The room was silent until the sharp sound of a highlighter hitting the glass desk shattered the peace. Mr. Virelli, you need to look at Section 14, subsection C, Lyra said, her voice steady but laced with an urgent tactical edge. Lucian leaned over her shoulder, his sharp jawline tightening as he scanned the dense legal jargon. At first glance, it appeared to be a standard intellectual property transfer. But Lyra pointed to a nested clause, a Trojan horse hidden within the digital rights management language. It wasn't just a merger. It was a total liquidation trigger. If Lucian signed, a fraudulent shell company owned by Lucian Virelli would gain immediate, irrevocable access to Virelli Enterprises' core encrypted assets, effectively bankrupting the empire in a single keystroke. They aren't partnering with you, Lucian, Lyra whispered, dropping the formal title for a split second, her bright eyes meeting his with a fierce protectiveness. They're dismantling you from the shadows. The realization hit Lucian like a physical blow. Lucian Virelli wasn't just a rival. He was a predator who had found the one crack in Lucian's armor. But the shock of the betrayal was eclipsed by the realization that Lyra, the girl he'd suspected of being a threat, was the only one standing between him and total ruin. She had bypassed 5 layers of security and legal oversight to find the trap his own board of directors had missed. How did you find this? Lucian asked, his voice a low rasp. I have a background in digital security and forensic accounting, she reminded him, her warm, professional smile returning, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. And I don't like seeing people get cheated out of what they've built. Lucian felt a surge of pride that he had no right to feel. She had his intellect, his viper instincts, but she possessed a selfless bravery that he had long ago traded for power. The stakes had just shifted from a corporate war to a battle for survival. He realized then that his circle of traitors was larger than he thought, and Lyra was the only ally he could truly trust. Get the car, Lucian commanded, his face hardening into the mask of the mafia-style kingpin the world feared. If Vane wants a war, we'll give him one. But first we're going to find out exactly who in this building helped him set this trap. As they stepped toward the elevator, Lucian caught the glint of the vintage locket once more. He knew the cleaning house had begun, But for the first time in 25 years he wasn't fighting for a legacy of stone and glass. He was fighting for the girl standing beside him. The neon pulse of the city hummed against the glass of the executive suite. But inside, the air was still and heavy with the scent of takeout and old secrets. The board members had long since retreated to their penthouses, leaving Lucian and Lyra alone amidst a sea of redlined contracts and glowing monitors. For the first time in his 30-year career, the Viper of Wall Street wasn't looking at a stock ticker. He was watching the way the lamplight caught the gold of the vintage locket around his assistant's neck. "You haven't touched your food," Lyra noted, her voice breaking the professional silence with a warmth that felt dangerously out of place in a room built for cold transactions. She nudged a carton toward him, her smile friendly yet possessing a sharp, observant edge that suggested she knew exactly what he was thinking. Lucian leaned back, his tailored navy jacket discarded, his salt and pepper hair slightly unkempt from hours of strategic warfare. He was a man who had survived by never letting his guard down, yet the way Lyra navigated his paranoia felt like a freight train of realizations hitting him all at once. He had spent decades forgetting how to listen to anyone he deemed powerless, but this girl, who held his legacy in her hands, was making his emotional armor crack. "I was thinking about the person who gave you that locket," Lucian said, his voice dropping to a low, gritty rasp that betrayed his usual executive composure. Lyra's hand moved instinctively to the jewelry, her fingers tracing the engraving. "It was my mother's. She told me it was a gift from a man who promised her the world before he went out to conquer it. She never said his name, but she kept it because she wanted me to remember that even the most powerful men are capable of leaving behind the things that actually matter." The words were a direct hit. Lucian felt the sting of a 25-year-old betrayal, not one committed against him, but one he had orchestrated himself. He looked at Lyra and didn't see an employee. He saw the ghost of the life he had traded for a billion-dollar empire. The silence stretched, no longer cold, but filled with a sudden aching hope for redemption. "Your mother was a wise woman," Lucian managed to say, his sharp jawline tightening as he fought to maintain the mask of the billionaire CEO. "She was a strong woman," Lyra corrected gently, her bright eyes locking onto his with a defiant intensity that confirmed she was his flesh and blood. "She taught me that power isn't about what you own, Lucian. It's about who you protect." For a moment, the $500 million merger and the circle of traders waiting in the wings vanished. In the flickering light of the office, the billionaire realized that the cleaning house he needed to do wasn't just corporate. It was personal. The first crack in the Viper's heart had finally formed, and as they sat together in the quiet of the tower, he realized he was no longer fighting for his company, but for the daughter who had just saved him from himself. The high-back leather chair felt less like a throne and more like a cage as Lucian stared at the digital surveillance feed Lyra had silently pulled onto his primary monitor. The Viper was known for his extreme paranoia, but as the grainy footage from the private elevator played, he realized his security hadn't just been bypassed, it had been sold. He watched in a cold, methodical silence as his chief operating officer Marco handed a thumb drive to a man with a distinct scarred hand. The man was a ghost, a fixer for Julian Vane, and he was currently walking through the heart of Virelli Enterprises with the casual ease of a ghost from the past. "They've been moving in the dark for months, Lucian," Lyra whispered, her voice steady but laced with the urgent tactical thriller tone that had become their shared language. She began to cycle through the ledger of offshore accounts she had uncovered, highlighting names that Lucian had trusted for 20 years. Marco, Vincent, and Eddie. It was a circle of traitors, an internal conspiracy designed to dismantle his organization while he was distracted by the glitter of the $500 million merger. Lucian's sharp jawline tightened, his confident features hardening into a mask of iron authority. He realized his reliance on fear and power had blinded him. He had forgotten how to listen to the subtle shifts in his own kingdom, deeming those beneath him as powerless assets. The stakes were no longer just about a failed business deal. If he didn't act, he would lose his life, his organization, and the entire legacy he had sacrificed his family to build. "They think I'm old and patient like them," Lucian said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He looked at Lyra, whose bright eyes reflected a fierce intelligence that surpassed even his most senior advisors. "They think I won't burn the house down to smoke out the rats." "You don't have to burn it down," Lyra countered, her warm, professional smile returning with a dangerous edge. You just have to change the locks before the pier goes dark. The cleaning house had begun. Lucian felt a strange shift in his cold nature. A flicker of hope for redemption sparked by the girl who was currently protecting his empire from the very men he had called brothers. He wasn't just a mafia-style kingpin anymore. He was a father evaluating a battlefield, and for the first time he wasn't fighting alone. The air in the glass-walled tower felt thin, a silent tactical thriller unfolding as the $500 million merger reached its breaking point. Lucian had spent his life building a kingdom through paranoia and iron authority, but as he watched Lyra work, he realized his emotional armor was cracking. She was no longer just an assistant. She was the ghost of a past he had tried to bury, now standing as the only wall between him and total liquidation. The elevator chimed and Julian Vane stepped out, his presence a methodical and patient threat. He didn't look at Lucian. His predatory gaze was fixed on Lyra. He tossed a manila envelope onto the mahogany desk, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent suite. Inside were photos of Lyra's mother, Elena, and a detailed timeline of Lyra's life, the missing years Lucian had never known. A brilliant hire, Lucian, Vane said, his voice a cold, gritty rasp. But I wonder if your board of directors knows you've brought a personal liability into the inner circle. Or perhaps if the girl knows her hero is the man who left her mother to rot in a coastal town for a few extra zeros on his bank balance. Vane leaned over the desk, his confidence suggesting he had already won. Walk away from the merger, Lucian. Hand over the encrypted assets, or I'll ensure Lyra's reputation is dismantled before the market opens. She'll be known as a corporate spy, a fraud who used a fake locket to manipulate a lonely old man. The room went still. Lucian's sharp jawline tightened, his features a mask of fury and a sudden aching hope for redemption. He looked at Lyra, expecting to see a thin, shivering girl broken by the threat. Instead, he saw a young woman with a warm, professional smile that didn't reach her eyes, a look that mirrored his own viper instincts. You're late, Julian, Lyra said, her voice steady and devoid of fear. She didn't flinch as she stepped toward the rival suit. While you were busy digging up my past, I was busy securing your future. Specifically, the future where the SEC receives the ledger of your offshore accounts that I discovered while you were methodically planning this blackmail. Lucian felt a surge of pride, a freight train of realizations hitting him. She wasn't a witness to be eliminated or a liability to be protected. She was a partner in an unlikely underworld war. Vane's face paled as the threat was no longer a future possibility. The cleaning house had officially begun. Get out, Lucian commanded, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that sent a clear message. The Viper was no longer alone. As Vane retreated, Lucian turned to Lyra. The $500 million deal was dead, but as he looked at the daughter who had just risked everything to save his legacy, he realized that for the first time in 25 years he was actually winning. The silence in the aftermath of Julian Vane's departure was heavier than the confrontation itself, a thick atmospheric tension that settled over the glass-walled office like a shroud. Lucian stood by the window, his tailored navy jacket discarded, his reflection in the glass showing a 48-year-old man who had built a kingdom of stone and steel but was currently standing in a graveyard of his own making. He had spent decades believing that power was a shield, a way to ensure he would never again be the man who had to choose between a paycheck and a person. He's gone, Lucian, Lyra said softly, her voice breaking through his cold, analytical trance. She was standing by the desk, the vintage locket resting against her white blouse, a constant, shimmering reminder of the life he had traded for his billions. Lucian turned, his sharp jawline tight, his features a mask of the Viper, who had survived through extreme paranoia and calculated isolation. He'll be back. Men like Vane are methodical and patient. They don't just walk away from $500 million because a girl found their offshore ledgers. He paced the room, his mind already beginning to evaluate Marco, Vincent, and Eddie, the traitors in his inner circle who had facilitated the breach. I need to clean house. I need to dismantle every connection, every bridge he could use to get back inside these walls. Lyra watched him, her bright eyes filled with a wisdom that seemed to come from the streets she had navigated while he sat in his ivory tower. And then what? You spend the next 20 years sitting in a bigger tower, even more alone than you were yesterday. Lucian stopped, his gaze snapping to hers. It's called survival, Lyra. It's how I built this. Fear is a reliable currency. Trust is a liability. Is it? Lyra stepped closer, her warm, professional smile replaced by a fierce, quiet intensity. You have a global reach, Lucian. You have more money than 10 generations could spend. But today, when your empire was being dismantled from the shadows, your billions couldn't hear the warning signs. Your power didn't notice the Trojan horse in the files. She gestured to the empty boardroom. Power is a tool, not a destination. If you spend your whole life sharpening the blade but never have anyone to stand at your back, then the blade eventually turns on you. Power is worthless if there's no one left to share it with. The words hit Lucian with the force of a freight train of realizations. He had viewed people as assets to be managed or threats to be eliminated, forgetting how to listen to those he deemed powerless. He looked at the daughter he was only just beginning to know. A girl who had risked her reputation and her future to save a man who had abandoned her before she was even born. My mother died believing you were a great man, Lyra whispered, her voice cracking the last of his emotional armor. Not because of the towers you built, but because of the man she thought you were before you let the gold blind you. She didn't keep that locket for the value of the gold, Lucian. She kept it for the connection. Lucian felt a shift in his cold nature, a sudden aching hope for redemption. For the first time in 25 years, the Viper wasn't looking for a tactical advantage. He was looking at a chance to finally be more than a kingpin of a hollow kingdom. I've spent a long time being a shark, Lucian said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. I don't know if I remember how to be anything else. Then let me show you, Lyra replied, her hand reaching out toward him. But the moment of connection was shattered as his phone buzzed with a frantic alert. Pier 17 had just gone dark and the $500 million betrayal was no longer a future threat. It was happening now. The low hum of the server banks was the first thing to die, replaced by a haunting, hollow silence that swallowed the executive suite. Lucian stood frozen as the panoramic views of the city skyline flickered and failed, the vibrant pulse of his empire flatlining in a single synchronized heartbeat. The backup generators groaned but remained dark. The Trojan horse virus Lyra had identified hadn't just been a financial trap. It was a total system override. Julian Vane wasn't just coming for the money anymore. He was coming for the throne, and he was starting by turning Lucian's own fortress against him. He's initiated the Pier 17 protocol, Lyra whispered, her face illuminated only by the frantic dying glow of her tablet. Her voice had lost its professional warmth, replaced by the urgent tactical edge of someone who had seen the bottom and knew how to survive it. The security feeds are looped, the elevators are locked down, and the internal communication lines have gone dark. We're officially invisible. Lucian felt a coldness wash over him that had nothing to do with the failing climate control. His reliance on fear and power had left him with a building full of employees who were now either fleeing in a panic or waiting for the new king to arrive. He looked at the emergency monitors, seeing the shadows of Vane's cleaning house team moving through the lobby with methodical precision. The threat was no longer a future possibility. The dismantling of Virelli Enterprises had begun in the dark. Marco, Vincent, Eddie, they aren't just traitors, Lucian, Lyra said, her fingers flying across the screen as she fought to regain a sliver of control. They've handed over the master encryption keys. Vane is currently rerouting every liquid asset you own into his offshore accounts. Lucian's sharp jawline tightened, his features hardening into the mask of the underworld-style kingpin he had been 30 years ago. He realized that his flaw, his belief that he was untouchable, had led him right into this slaughter. But as he looked at Lyra, standing defiant in the shadows of his failing empire, he felt a shift in his nature. He wasn't a man who had survived through extreme paranoia just to die in a glass cage. If they want the keys to the kingdom, let them have the locks, Lucian growled, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He reached into his desk, pulling out a physical override key he hadn't touched in a decade. But they've forgotten one thing about Vipers, Lyra. We're most dangerous when we're cornered in the dark. He looked at the daughter who had become his unlikely ally, his heart cracking further as he realized he was finally ready to risk his legacy to protect her. The tower was dark, his board was compromised, and his rival was at the gate. But for the first time in 25 years, Lucian Virelli wasn't fighting for a $500 million merger. He was fighting for his blood. The emergency lights pulsed a rhythmic, visceral red, casting Lucian's sharp jawline in shadows that made him look like the feared underworld kingpin he had once been. Julian Vane stood at the threshold of the office, flanked by the traders Marco and Vincent, his face twisted into a smirk of methodical victory. He held a tablet displaying the final transfer of Lucian's encrypted assets, a $500 million liquidation that was seconds away from completion. "It's over, Lucian," Vane gloated, his voice a cold rasp. "Sign the physical override, or the girl's reputation isn't the only thing that dies in this tower tonight." Lucian didn't look at the tablet. He looked at Lyra, who stood defiant even as Vincent moved to intercept her. The Viper felt a freight train of realizations hit him. His empire was a hollow kingdom of glass, but the girl wearing the vintage locket was his true legacy. His cold nature finally shattered, replaced by a fierce, protective hope for redemption. "You made one mistake, Julian," Lucian said, his voice a low, gravelly growl that silenced the room. "You thought you were blackmailing me with a liability. You didn't realize you were threatening my daughter." The room froze. Lyra's breath hitched, her bright eyes widening as the truth she had carried in silence was finally spoken aloud by the man who had abandoned her 25 years ago. Lucian stepped forward, ignoring the digital trap in the circle of spies. He reached into his desk and instead of signing the transfer he triggered a localized EMP pulse he had installed years ago for a cleaning house scenario. The monitors went black. The $500 million transfer vanished into a void of unrecoverable data. Vane's face paled as he realized that Lucian had just nuked his own fortune to neutralize the threat. "I can rebuild a company," Lucian stated, standing between Lyra and the men who sought to hurt her. "But I can't rebuild 25 years of lost time. The merger is dead, Julian. And so is your career." As security teams, loyal only to Lucian's private payroll, burst into the room to remove the traitors, the billionaire turned to Lyra. The professional mask was gone, replaced by the face of a father who had finally learned that power is worthless without someone to share it with. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he touched the vintage locket. "I know who you are, Lyra," he whispered, his voice cracking with an emotion he hadn't felt in decades. "And I'm not leaving again." In the wreckage of his multi-billion-dollar empire, Lucian Virelli had lost his status as the most feared man on Wall Street. But as Lyra's hand closed over his, he realized he had finally gained everything that actually mattered. Justice had been served, the Vipers were purged, and for the first time the king was no longer alone in his tower.